Today, I'm going to show you how to play against the London system. It's a popular opening, and there are tons of videos showing how to play it, but it's just as important to know how to counter it and shut down its main ideas. It's called a system because white's moves are almost always the same, and if you're ready for it, you can achieve a win rate of over 80%. The basic idea is that white places the bishop on f4, the pawns on e3, d4, and c3, and the knights on f3 and d2. From there, white follows a few typical patterns. For example, if black has a pawn on g6, white will usually play the light-squared bishop to e2. Otherwise, you'll often see this bishop placed on d3 or b5. These are the common setups for white's bishop. What else does white do? The queen usually goes to e2 or c2 to prepare the break on e4. And sometimes, when the bishop is on b5, the queen might head to a5 to put pressure on the c6 square. These are common patterns you'll see often from players using the London system. All right, let me give you some tips and recommendations for when you're up against the London system. My first tip is to play the move c5. This move is really important. White fights hard to control the e5 square. They'll place the bishop, the knight, and the pawn on d4, all focused on e5, making it a strong point. But when you play c5, you create tension in the center. At some point, white might take the pawn, and if they do, you'll recapture with the bishop. That will weaken their control over e5 because they'll lose the support of the d-pawn. So, c5 is a great move, and I really recommend playing it when you're up against the London system. That's my first tip and recommendation for you. The second recommendation is to play bishop to d6. This move is key. There are some variations where you don't play bishop to d6, but I think it's a great choice, especially when you're just starting to face the London system and want to challenge its typical ideas. So what happens when you play bishop to d6? White has to make a decision. They can either capture the bishop, which is not a great idea for white, or they can play the strongest move into position, bishop to g3. These are the two main options white has. If they decide to capture the bishop on d6, you'll simply recapture with the queen. Queen takes d6 makes it much easier for black to play, because black can quickly push e5 and get into a strong position. That's exactly what happened in this game. I'm going to skip ahead a few moves in the game to continue with the explanation. If your opponent plays bishop takes d6, which is our second topic, just recapture with the queen and then go for the break on e5. This is a powerful move for black as it opens up threats like pushing e4 at the right moment to create a fork. At the same time, it gives black a solid structure and clears up any issues you might face in the opening. So if white takes on d6, you take back with the queen and aim for e5. That wraps up our first analysis of the typical plans against the London system. Now let's move on to our second plan, which focuses on the idea of playing knight to e5. In this position, white's strongest move is bishop to g3. A common idea, especially if you're new to chess or don't have much experience with middle game strategy, is to capture the bishop on g3. But listen, you shouldn't take that bishop right away as black, because if you make that capture, let's say, instead of taking it right away, I castle first. Then, white plays bishop to d3. If I take the bishop then, the pawn recaptures and opens the h-file. With that open file, white's rook will take control and create a dangerous kingside attack. So, don't capture that bishop right away. Only take it if your opponent has already played something like b6 and castled, making it safe for you to capture. Otherwise, just leave it alone. Only go for the capture when you're sure it's safe. If you take it too early, white's rook will dominate the open file, and defending as black will be much harder. In this game, white played bishop to g3, which is the recommended move and the most common one. The game continued with castling, bishop to d3, and b6. Black followed a standard development here. Now, white has to choose their plan. Usually, they'll either aim for the pawn push e4, which we'll talk about next, or play knight to e5, which is what happened in this position. So, white played knight to e5, and you definitely don't want to take it with your knight, because if you capture with the knight, they'll recapture with the pawn and fork you. That's why you can't make that capture. Instead, black played bishop to b7 to defend the knight. This move is crucial. It defends the knight and keeps black's position solid. One common idea for white in this kind of position, especially after playing knight to e5, is to strengthen their setup by pushing f4. Now let me share an idea for a plan when you come across this pawn on f4 and the knight on e5. It's a subtle idea involving the move knight to e7. It might seem like an odd move at first, but there's a clear logic behind it. When white plays f4, they create a very weak square, e4. You need to bring more pieces to control this square. In this case, you already have the knight and the pawn working on it. By playing knight to e7, your bishop also starts controlling that square. So this knight to e7 move is very subtle and effective. The game continued with queen to f3, followed by knight to f5. If the bishop captures, you recapture with the pawn, adding yet another piece to control the weak e4 square, which is a major weakness for white. The doubled pawns compensate for the structural weakness. Then, the game proceeded with bishop to d2, and every move from this point on was aimed at controlling that square. Bishop to e7 comes with the idea of playing knight to d6, bringing yet another piece to dominate e4. White played g4, then knight to d6, followed by g5. Black placed the knight on e4, castled long, turning it into an opposite side castling situation. In such positions, the first thing you should do is secure control of the center, which black had already achieved. From there, the side that launches the first successful attack will win. In this game, black managed to strike very quickly. Moves like c4, b5, b4, along with the a-pawn advancing, were unstoppable, leaving white unable to counterattack effectively. Let's move on to our next topic. I'm going to talk about ideas connected to e4. So, we're still in the same position. Bishop on g3, castling, bishop on e3, b6, and then e4. Now instead of playing knight to e5, your opponent goes for e4. So what does that change for you? The first thing you need to be careful about is that if you don't respond right away, white can play e5, setting up a fork again. This type of fork is very common in this position if you're not careful. Can you capture the pawn? Technically yes, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you do, the position becomes very open and ends up favoring white over black. So what's the key move here against e4? It might look strange, but it's bishop to e7. Why bishop to e7? Here's the idea. In these positions where e4 is played, it's very common for white to push e5 at some point and set up threats. Your knight will have to move, and white can go for a bishop to h7, king to h7, knight to g5, and then the queen joins the attack, creating mate threats. This tactical theme is common in such openings because the position resembles lines from the French defense. To avoid falling into this, bishop to e7 is very effective. When your knight has to move, say to h5 or d7, the bishop will still control the g5 square. That's why bishop to e7 is the move here. In the game I'm showing you, it continued with e5, knight to h5. The key idea to avoid falling behind in the middle game is to play bishop to e7. If white pushes e5, you have knight to h5, which creates problems for white. And once white castles, you can capture the bishop with your knight, leaving you in a very comfortable position. Now let's move on to our final topic, the bishop to b5 plan. This idea with bishop to b5 is very common and became quite popular because Magnus has played it a lot, and he still uses it from time to time. So what's the deal with this move? You need to be cautious when dealing with bishop to b5. Instead of playing a6, which is the standard response, I'd recommend a simpler idea, bishop to e7 again. This idea is very similar to the one we discussed earlier with e4. White will rarely trade the bishop for the knight, as giving up the bishop pair is unlikely. So the white bishop doesn't really do much here. At some point, black can play queen to b6 and create threats, including targeting the b2 pawn in some cases. Because of this, the white bishop isn't very effective in this position, and white often ends up retreating it. The position ends up resembling the one we talked about earlier. As black, you can play comfortably here without exposing yourself to unnecessary risks. And with that, we've covered all the key plans for countering the London system. Today, we saw how to face this opening effectively. We started by understanding its typical structure and common plans, and then we explored 5 practical responses. The move c5 to weaken white's center, bishop to d6 to gain space and prepare e5, ideas to counter knight on e5 using knight to e7, how to neutralize the e4 push with bishop to e7, and finally, the safest way to respond to bishop to b5. With these strategies, you'll be ready to face the London and even secure more wins. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to keep improving your chess and like the way I explain, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps me create more content like this for you. See you in the next video.